Welcome back. Voting is underway in the Gauteng Provincial Legislature this afternoon for a new premier following the resignation of David Makura earlier this week. The two candidates are the ANC's Panyaza Lesufi and the DA's Solly Msimanga, members of the Provincial Legislature. As you're looking now at this live picture, continuing to cast their votes in a secret ballot presided over by the Gauteng Deputy Judge President Aubrey Ledwaba. Let's stay with these pictures and bring in political analyst Professor Steven Friedman. Prof, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us today. So, a new premier being elected, but I think a good place to start would be with the now former premier, David Makura, and how you would say he fared as the head of the government in the province. How would you assess his time and his legacy?
Yeah, thanks, Tembakile. Look, I think it probably takes us into something else you might want to talk about. When David Makura became Premier of Gauteng, he became well known for doing precisely the kind of things which Panyaza Lesufi is very often praised for. He spent a great deal of time on the ground. There was the famous story early on in his premiership where he stood in a hospital queue to get a sense of how people were experiencing going to public hospitals. And in that sense, he started off really trying to reconnect with the citizens of Gauteng. But somehow that got lost along the way. It may simply be because, you start off with enthusiasm and then things start to decline. But really that sense of trying to reconnect with the citizens, trying to be in touch with the citizens, really withered as the premiership went on. One of the features, I think, of the premiership is as that happened, the premier became more and more likely to blame people from elsewhere in Africa for what was happening in Gauteng than to accept responsibility himself. So I think in a nutshell, it was a premiership which started with a great deal of promise, but the promise was never quite fulfilled.
Just on what you were saying now, Prof, about how David Makura was praised for, if you will, for leading a campaign to try and reconnect with the people of Gauteng. It feels now with the election of Panyaza Lesufi that's very much what the ANC intends to do, because that disconnect is very much reflected in its electoral losses in recent years. But when you go back to Makura, the success of that reconnection, the ANC says would have been perhaps more turbulent because, he came in at a time of great flux. Nomvula Mokonyane was going to Parliament to take up a ministerial position and a lot was happening. So did the circumstances, do you think, work against his ability to perform at optimum level?
Well, I think Panyaza Lesufi's problem is that if you go back once again to the beginning of the Makura premiership, he took over, or he was right at the beginning at a stage in which we had the first evidence that loss of support that you're talking about was beginning to emerge, where the ANC vote in Gauteng was beginning to erode. And Makura's response to that was precisely to say, well, we've lost touch with our voters and we need to reconnect with them. The problem, of course, that Lesufi has is that a few years down the road, the problems got worse. Voters are ditching the ANC in Gauteng in greater numbers than they were then. Of course, Lesufi's challenge is how do you turn this around? One has to be honest and say he has a very stiff challenge ahead of him. Given not only that the ANC's been losing votes, in Gauteng, but that if you have a look at the municipal by-election results since the last local election, they're doing even worse in Gauteng now than they were doing in November last year. So there's been a very widespread lack of confidence in Gauteng. And therefore, Mr. Lesufi obviously will be elected premier because the ANC has the numbers for that. He has a very difficult task trying to change that around because, you're dealing with years now of people feeling that they aren't being heard.
And to what extent do you think the ANC is counting on his PR positioning, if you will, the public goodwill that Panyaza Lesufi enjoys as education MEC because of the various battles that many would say he's been leading right at the front as MEC, always being seen to be there in times of crisis, be it when there have been protests by parents outside of school or when a child has tragically died. Others, yes, have criticized him, saying, well, those were all elements of him grandstanding and just wanting to be seen, but not necessarily being as effective as he was visible.
Well, you see, obviously the test is going to be, and you're quite right. I mean, the reason why the ANC is switching from Mr. Makura to Mr. Lesufi is precisely in the hope that aura about him, that he is the person who cares, he's the person who goes out there, who pays attention, who talks to people, that will be able to do what David Makura was unable to do a few years ago. And, the obvious point to make about that is when you're premier of a province, people are far more likely to want to know what those appearances actually translate into. It's not enough, I think, for people if he's able to keep that up, because the pressures on a premier are a lot greater than the pressures on an MEC. But even if he's able to keep it up, people are not simply going to say, well, we feel good about our leadership because the premier came to see us. They're going to want to know if the premier was able to do anything to change their situation. And if the ANC has any chance of getting 50% in Gauteng in 2024, which I have to say at the moment looks highly unlikely. But if they have any chance of that at all, then, it's not going to be enough for him to simply be there in times of crisis. He's going to have to show that he can do something to fix what caused the crisis in the first place. And obviously that's a huge challenge.
And just on the importance of the role of the Premier, perhaps we can bring up those shots, please, of the voting that's going on in Council and get a bigger picture so we can look at that better while Prof and I speak. Prof, when you talk about the role of the Premier in government and accounting, there had been a feeling among the public and the opposition parties in the Gauteng legislature that David Makura, in times of crisis, would only condemn, be shocked, be horrified along with the rest of us, but never really took accountability for the many disasters and blunders by government, including the disastrous Esidimeni relocation project where 144 psychiatric patients are known to have died, where Gatani Mahlangu resigned as health MEC, but he never faced, quote unquote, the consequences, according to the likes of the DA, for what happened.
Yeah. Well, of course, that's obviously, there's political debates about how much, is firing the MEC enough? I mean, obviously, in any system of government anywhere, you'd expect the head of government to stand down whenever a member of that government has done something like that. So the ANC could very well argue, look, the MEC paid the price, which was appropriate. An inquiry's been set up. There has been an attempt to deal with the issue. But, the point that the Premier didn't take enough accountability, I think, is a valid point. And I mentioned earlier on, there was, I think, a disturbing feature in his premiership that as things went on, and it seemed that as things became more difficult, blaming people from elsewhere in the continent became very convenient, So if the hospitals were not working, there were all these claims which have never been proven that the hospitals are flooded with Mozambicans and Zimbabweans, etc. And that argument was used about other services as well. Now, as soon as you start doing that with respect, you're shifting the blame somewhere else. You're saying, well, it's not my fault. It's circumstances beyond my control. Now, the election results show very clearly that doesn't work. So if Mr. Lesufi is going to go on that tack, then the ANC has no chance at all of regaining support. If he does take responsibility, if he does level with the citizens of Gauteng and say, look, errors have been made, we take responsibility, we're going to try and fix those errors, then he starts off on a much better footing.
What about the ANC and even the Gauteng ANC's position on what it says should be a war on corruption? I mean, various departments have been affected, not least of which the Gauteng Health Department, the Education Department, where Lesufi is now leaving. was also found wanting when it came to contracts being awarded in line with proper procedure. How steep a hill do you think that will be for the new Premier?
Well, I think it will be a steep hill for him, but I think something needs to be said about that, which is how we should judge the new Premier on these issues. Because, unfortunately, for a whole variety of reasons, corruption, as we know, is very common in both the public and private sectors in this country. And I don't think it's fair to blame whoever's in charge because corruption happens. I don't think the leader has been invented yet who can prevent corruption happening. What we ought to judge him and other leaders on is what they do about the corruption. First of all, how zealous they are in making sure that they do their best to uncover it, yes. But when it does appear, as happened in his department, the issue becomes, well, what do you do about it? Do you make sure that every step is taken to fix it? And once again, that should be what they're judged on. If we're going to judge all our politicians by whether they prevent every act of corruption happening, then I'm afraid we're not going to have any politicians left.
I wonder, though, Prof, if I can come in there, if the leaders themselves, the politicians, don't oversell how much they can do about corruption, because when they pitch it, they pretend as though they could solve it altogether.
I would agree with that entirely. And, it's not a problem only in South Africa, all around the world. You thump the tub and you say, I'm going to get rid of corruption. And not nearly enough people say, well, how are you going to do it and what are the constraints? A few years ago, when Pravin Gordhan was still Minister of Finance, he promised in a budget to root out corruption, and next year had to come back to Parliament and say, well, look, this is a lot more difficult than I thought, and it's going to take a lot longer than I thought. And I think it's perfectly true to say that there's a lot of grandstanding by politicians who tout themselves as corruption busters and aren't honest with the public about how difficult that really is.
Just to update our viewers, Prof, please stand by for us. We're looking now at those shots from the provincial legislature in Gauteng, where the ballot boxes, I should say, have now been carried out of the chambers. There's going to be counting that happens, monitored, shall we say, by the Gauteng Deputy Judge President, Obrile Dwaba, and the officials involved in this voting process. You see that IEC box there. Once that counting is done and the votes have been tallied, the presiding judge will return to the chambers and announce who the new Premier will be. As Professor Friedman was saying earlier, for all intents and purposes, it would appear that the ANC will be able to push through for the election of Panyaza Lesufi based on its numbers in this provincial legislature. But, Prof, just on that note, the ANC is very aware of its waning electoral support. And just yesterday, Panyaza Lesufi was having to clarify, if you will, the sort of arrangement the party has been able to reach with the EFF as far as coalitions are concerned. They voted together in Joburg to remove the DA, just last week removing the mayor. But do you think it's too soon, or if this is the perfect time to sort of start planning for 2024, especially if they want to be in charge of the province at this level?
Yeah, very good question. And it goes back to what I said earlier about, whoever's in charge. The chances, quite frankly, of the ANC getting 50% plus in Gauteng next time around are very, very slim. And that obviously means that the challenge for Panyaza Lesufi as he becomes Premier and as leader of the ANC in the province will be to make sure try to make sure that those coalitions favour the ANC. Now, he comes in at what may be a very opportune time for him, as you correctly say. There is a thawing of relationships between the ANC and the EFF, at least for now. But more important, I think that if you look back at what's happened in Johannesburg over the last few weeks, or the last week or so, that I think gives him an opportunity. Because the tide has been moving against the ANC as far as coalitions are concerned, because smaller parties have been throwing in their lot with the DA. As we all heard last week, the smaller parties are extremely unhappy with the DA, interestingly including Action SA, who is a close ally of the DA. Now, Action SA is never going to go into a coalition with the ANC. But you may well find that if the ANC are sympathetic to coalition partners, if they're able to convince the smaller parties that they care more about their concerns than the DA does, then the ANC has a very strong chance of being the leading party in a coalition after the next general election, after 2024. But then, of course, he has to do the groundwork now. If you want to build those relationships, I think one of the problems with coalitions in this country is that the parties in the coalition haven't been building strong relationships between each other, and we see that in the way in which the coalitions collapse so quickly. So if he's able, which would be a very prudent thing to do given the way the voters are going, if he's able to set up those kind of links, not only with the EFF, but with some of the other parties in the province, to create a situation where it's much likely that they'll be prepared to govern with the ANC than with the DA, then he's probably doing far more for the ANC than any other premier could do in the circumstances. It's probably the strategically wisest path that he could take.
The other conversation that's ongoing reports suggestions that David Makura, who's said so far that he's going to take a bit of a break, reflect on his time as Premier and broader political career, may take up a position in Parliament. That's not confirmed yet, but should he go to the National Assembly, what value would you see him adding there? Would you see him as a minister, chairperson of a portfolio committee?
Well, I think it would be very unlikely that he would go as some of the other former provincial premiers have gone as simply an ordinary MP. Initially, probably he would be appointed as the chair of a portfolio committee. But there would be significant support for him to become a cabinet minister. I mean, remember that up until a few days ago, there was talk that he would make himself available for the ANC Secretary General's job. That obviously is not going to happen. He's decided to stand aside from that. But I think that if he does go to Parliament as an MP, the chances of him appearing as a deputy minister must be extremely high. But the chances of a cabinet post must also be good in a couple of years from now.
Professor Steven Friedman, always good to speak to you. Thank you, sir.